Welcome back, everybody. You're watching A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are reading State of War, A Secret History of the CIA and the Bush Administration by James Risen. If you liked the episode, hit the like and subscribe button. Hit that notification bell in case you get unsubscribed by YouTube. And that way you get notified when I make a new video. Both of those things. So, let's dig in. Chapter 7. Losing Afghanistan. By November 2004, Colin Powell was a lion in winter. A sad yet still regal figure who seemed to personify an era of great Republican statesmanship that was passing away. As he quietly slipped out of office in the aftermath of George W. Bush's re-election, a fitting epitaph for his tenure as Secretary of State was perhaps that he was a giant of a man who deserved better. 4 years earlier, he had joined the Bush administration with great promise. A genuine American hero whose credibility with the nation easily outweighed that of the inexperienced new president. The former general had campaigned for Bush during the 2000 presidential race, and Bush had made it clear to voters that if he were elected, he would appoint Powell to be his Secretary of State and would make him the leader of his foreign policy team. Powell's presence by Bush's side was a reassuring sight for voters, and it encouraged many to believe that Bush would adhere to the same centrist, pragmatic approach to foreign policy that had been the bulwark of his father's time in the Oval Office. With Powell at state, and Dick Cheney, his father's Secretary of Defense and one of Powell's old partners in Desert Storm, as his running mate, George W. Bush seemed to be signaling to the public in 2000 that if you vote for me, you will get the second coming of the successful team that forged an international coalition to liberate Kuwait and also brought a peaceful end to the Cold War. I'm not sure I'm enjoying this author's bias, but we'll keep going anyway. That was certainly what Powell had expected, but he also thought there was more. He returned to public service with the ambition of following in the footsteps of another who had made the transition from wartime general to diplomat, George C. Marshall, Harry Truman's Secretary of State and the architect of the Marshall Plan. One of Powell's great strengths, and perhaps his fatal flaw, was his deep sense of loyalty, a trait ingrained during his career in the military and polished into a political attribute through his years in top jobs in the Reagan and first Bush administrations. It was not difficult for him to extend his close association with President George Herbert Walker Bush, whom he served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Persian Gulf War, to Bush's son. But over time, Powell's sense of loyalty became a heavy burden. None of the high expectations for Powell were realized. He became a marginalized figure, trapped in an administration over which he had little influence. To the surprise of almost everyone in Washington, and perhaps to Powell himself, he was repeatedly outmaneuvered on foreign policy by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and by Cheney, who returned to government from his years in business with a far less flexible mindset than many of his old colleagues could remember from his days in the first Bush administration. Cheney's transformation in particular seemed to mystify Powell. Throughout his constant battles with Rumsfeld's Pentagon, his surprising break with Cheney, and his obvious misgivings about the invasion of Iraq, Powell's sense of loyalty demanded that he stay at least through one full term. He seemed content to play a civilizing role to try to mediate between the ascendant conservatives in Washington and the rest of the world. Powell developed a few moderate allies, including CIA Director George Tenet, but ironically it was his trust in Tenet that ultimately led to Powell's greatest disaster. With Tenet's assurances, Powell agreed to go on to the United Nations to make the administration's case against Saddam Hussein in February 2003. And Powell got the full weight of his name and stature behind what turned out to be deeply flawed intelligence on Iraq's supposed weapons of mass destruction. His reputation never completely recovered. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in the fall of 2005, when the competency and credibility of the Bush administration was once again under question, Powell told ABC News that he recognized that his flawed UN presentation on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction had tarnished his reputation, although he insisted that he did not blame Tenet personally for providing him with inaccurate intelligence. After America's initial triumph in Baghdad turned into bloody stalemate, Powell's loyalty to Bush came to seem more like bureaucratic passivity. Criticism mounted, and by the end his dream of joining George C. Marshall in the pantheon of great American statesmen seemed more distant than ever. Both Powell's good intentions and his political weaknesses in the face of Rumsfeld's skillful infighting were on display in one of the last meetings of the Bush War Cabinet that he attended not long after Bush's re-election. Fittingly, on the agenda for the November 2004 meeting was the place where it all began for the Bush team, Afghanistan. At the time, the Bush administration was trying its best to ignore the harsh realities of Afghanistan. The White House had not yet faced up to the unintended consequences of George W. Bush's most fateful decision as president to invade Iraq before the job against al-Qaeda was finished. And so now, not only was Osama bin Laden still on the loose somewhere along Pakistan's lawless frontier, but Afghanistan, threatened by an unprecedented surge in opium production, was dangerously close to becoming a narco state. In public, President Bush and his senior advisors continued to hail Afghanistan as an unalloyed success, and there certainly were reasons for optimism. My eyes and my mouth, they can go at the same time. I know they can. Afghanistan was a country where Islamic extremists and global terrorists had been routed by an American-led coalition in favor of a new democratic government and a more tolerant way of life. A puppet government installed by George W. Bush. Turnout for the Afghan elections in October 2004 was high despite the threat of violence, and the electoral triumph solidified the position of Afghan President Hamid Karzai, a U.S. client who had returned to Afghanistan from exile in Pakistan in 2001, escorted by a phalanx of CIA officers and U.S. Special Forces troops. At a time when conditions in Iraq were worsening by the day, the last thing the Bush administration wanted to do was tarnish the image of success in Central Asia. But deep in the bowels of the State Department, in its counter-narcotics policy shop, the Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, INL, there was a darkening sense of doom about Afghanistan. Assistant Secretary of State Bobby Charles, who ran INL, was watching the new numbers rolling in from the Central Intelligence Agency on the unchecked growth in opium production in the Afghan countryside with a sense of disbelief. A protege of House Speaker Dennis Hastert, Charles was at heart a creature of the Republican Congress, not of the Bush White House, and he had a keen sense of how issues played with Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill. He knew that drug trafficking was always a hot-button issue. If the American people became broadly aware of the scale of the drug crisis in Afghanistan, and that the United States was not doing anything about it, he realized that congressional sentiment would quickly shift. Think the American people care that much if drugs are out of control in Afghanistan? I mean, before we were at war there? Every time the CIA issued a new classified estimate on the size of the Afghan poppy crop, the numbers worsened, and Charles felt compelled to tell anyone in the administration who would listen that Washington had to do something. It wouldn't be long, he warned, before political progress in Afghanistan was drowned under a flood of opium. I started clanging the fire bell, he recalled. You had to take it seriously or it would devour the democracy. Charles had Powell's solid support, but he was deeply frustrated that his warnings were being turned out at the White House and that his fears, both about the Afghan drug crisis and its potential political consequences, were not widely shared within the administration. In early 2004, he heard veiled and indirect complaints from the White House about downbeat testimony he gave to Congress on the problem, and yet Charles couldn't mask his own growing pessimism. He was so concerned that he soon was being called Cassandra around his own office, while a White House official warned him that he was becoming inconvenient because he refused to remain silent on Afghanistan's worsening conditions. When he persisted in late 2004, Charles was told that he was now highly inconvenient. Eventually, Charles would be forced out of his job by new Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in early 2005. Senior Bush administration officials had displayed a complete lack of interest in the Afghan opium problem ever since 9/11. In fact, the White House and Pentagon went out of their way to avoid taking on the Afghan drug lords from the very outset of U.S. military operations in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in the fall and winter of 2001. According to a CIA source, after the 1998 bombings of 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa by Al-Qaeda, the U.S. intelligence community created an interagency team to identify potential bombing targets in Afghanistan to be used in any military operations against the terrorist network's Afghan sanctuary. That targeting team kept working even after President Clinton ordered a half-hearted cruise missile strike on Al-Qaeda terrorist camps just days after the East Africa bombings. By 2001, the team had generated a comprehensive list of potential bombing targets throughout Afghanistan. The list included 20 to 25 major drug labs, warehouses, and other drug-related facilities. After the September 11th attacks, the interagency team turned its list of potential targets over to the U.S. military. But the Pentagon and White House refused to order the bombings of any of the drug-related facilities on the list, according to the CIA source. On the day after 9/11, that target list was ready to go, and the military and the NSC threw it out the window, said the CIA source. We had tracked these targets for years. The drug targets were big places, almost like small towns that did nothing but produce heroin. The British were screaming for us to bomb those targets, because most of the heroin in Britain comes from Afghanistan, but they refused. If the United States had bombed those facilities, the CIA source added, it would have slowed down drug production in Afghanistan for a year or more. The decision not to bomb the drug labs in the weeks after 9/11 was the first sign that the White House and Pentagon wanted nothing to do with nation-building problems like narcotics in Afghanistan. American troops were there to fight terrorists, not suppress the poppy crop. And Pentagon officials didn't see a connection between the two. The Pentagon feared that counter-narcotics operations would force the military to turn on the very same warlords who were aiding the United States against the Taliban, and that would lead to another round of violent attacks on American troops. According to one former NSC official, Undersecretary of Defense Doug Feith argued in a White House meeting in February 2002 that counter-narcotics was not part of the war on terrorism, and so defense wanted no part of it in Afghanistan. We couldn't get defense to do counter-narcotics in Afghanistan, recalled the former NSC official. We needed a quote for that. What's more, President Bush's decision to invade Iraq meant that there were severe limits on the numbers of U.S. troops available for deployment to Afghanistan. Even if the Pentagon had been ordered to do more about the drug trade, it didn't have enough troops on the ground to do the job effectively. Once the Taliban had been routed, top CIA officials had little interest in the drug problem either, even as some CIA officials were urging the bombing of Afghan drug labs after 9/11. The agency's senior management was gutting the staffing of the agency's counter-narcotics center in order to meet the demands of counter-terrorism. The counter-narcotics job in Afghanistan was initially left up to the British, who cared deeply about the issue since so much Afghan heroin ended up on London streets. Only more recently has the United States become a growth market for Afghan heroin, now accounting for as much as 10% of the traffic. Yet, Britain had far fewer military and intelligence resources available in Afghanistan than did the United States. And so 2002, the first year that Afghanistan was effectively under American control, saw a dramatic revival of the opium trade. Opium production had been cut at the end of the Taliban rule, although not for altruistic motives. In 2001, the Taliban officially banned the cultivation of opium, yet the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration later reported that it believed the ban was imposed in effort to raise prices on Taliban-controlled heroin in the face of a glutted market. The Taliban had large stockpiles of opium in warehouses at the time of the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan, according to former U.S. officials. Still, the Taliban cutbacks meant that Afghan opium production in 2001 bottomed out at just 74 metric tons. Once the new American-backed government took control in Kabul, opium production skyrocketed. with controls from the central government effectively lifted, Afghanistan's production capacity for oven-dried opium soared to 1,278 metric tons in 2002, according to DEA statistics. Production more than doubled in 2003 and then nearly doubled again in the next year. And by 2004, Afghanistan was producing 87% of the world's opium supply. Holy crap. In late 2004, the CIA estimated that 206,000 hectares were under poppy cultivation and that the new crop would generate $7 billion worth of heroin. There is no other country in the world that has 206,000 hectares under cultivation of any drug, observes Charles. Heroin was Afghanistan's leading export and the engine driving the country's economy. With the Americans in charge, the drug business was booming. There were reports of 60 truck convoys. In other words, convoys of 60 trucks, loaded down with opium, crossing the border from Afghanistan into, guess where? Iran. Afghanistan was on the verge of surpassing Colombia as the illicit drug capital of the world. Inevitably, the new U.S.-backed Afghan government was becoming badly corrupted by the heroin trade. Even as President Bush was hailing Afghanistan as an unalloyed success story, the narco-state label was beginning to stick. Excuse me. By 2005, the United States suspected that at least one senior official in the Afghan government was corrupted by the drug trade, according to American officials. While Afghanistan's regional governments were in even worse shape, particularly in the Afghan provinces where the poppy crop was flourishing the most. American sources say that some regional officials in Afghanistan now make huge sums of money by taxing drug traffickers for their opium and heroin shipments rather than seizing them. With money from the booming opium trade coursing through Afghanistan, there are growing suspicions that many of the same Afghans who have received large amounts of money or other forms of support from the United States government since 9/11 are now either involved in the Afghan opium business or have been corrupted by money stemming from drug smuggling. For years, unproven conspiracy theories about the CIA's role in cocaine trafficking even. For years, unproven conspiracy theories about the CIA's role in cocaine trafficking from Latin America have abounded. Now in Afghanistan, the heroin trade is so pervasive that there are certain to be serious questions raised in the future about whether the CIA, the U.S. military, and the rest of the Bush administration got too close to Afghans enmeshed in the global heroin business. Barnett Rubin, one of America's leading experts on Afghanistan, wrote in 2004 that Rumsfeld has met with Afghan military commanders whom Afghans know as the godfathers of drug trafficking. The message has been clear. Help fight the Taliban, and no one will interfere with your drug trafficking. The policies put in place by the Defense Department, and particularly the rules of engagement for U.S. troops, certainly didn't help allay such suspicions. The Pentagon's rules of engagement for U.S. forces in Afghanistan said that if U.S. troops discovered drug shipments or drug supplies, they could destroy them. That was very different from issuing firm rules stating that U.S. forces must destroy any drugs discovered. The permissive guidance for American troops was a sign that countering drugs was not a priority, and meant that there could be times when American commanders on the ground would have the option of allowing drug shipments to pass unimpeded, particularly if the drugs were under the protection of an Afghan warlord whom the United States did not want to antagonize. That sounds kind of immoral, but I understand that. By 2003, there were reports that American troops were ignoring shipments of opium where they discovered the drugs during searches in Afghanistan. Mark Schneider, senior vice president of the non-profit International Crisis Group, said that during a trip to Afghanistan in November 2003, he was told by U.S. military commanders and State Department officials that they were frustrated by the rules of engagement. A Green Beret who served in Afghanistan and who has since left the military said that in private, U.S. commanders on the ground were much more blunt. He said he was specifically ordered to ignore heroin and opium when he and his unit discovered them on patrol. Drug trafficking was taking place virtually right in front of the American military. In some cases, they were destroying drugs, but in others, they weren't, complains Charles. Rumsfeld didn't want drugs to become a core mission. Even more troubling than the ambiguous guidelines was the fact that the United States had intelligence on the locations of key heroin processing laboratories and warehouses, particularly in southeastern Afghanistan, and yet was doing nothing to interrupt their operations. The new intelligence came on the heels of the earlier targeting information that had been ignored during the initial invasion of Afghanistan. Once again, the Pentagon refused to order that the labs and warehouses be bombed, even though Charles and other American officials were certain that the destruction of the labs and supply facilities would have had a significant impact on the Afghan opium business. The case for targeting the infrastructure as the choke point in the Afghan drug trade was underlined in January 2004 when a British Special Forces team operating in Afghanistan called in an airstrike on a drug lab by a U.S. Air Force A-10 aircraft. The resulting damage led quickly to a 15% spike in heroin prices. It is unclear whether senior American commanders knew at the time that the proposed target in the bombing raid was a drug lab, but it was not followed up with further bombing raids on drug facilities. We had regular reports of where the drug labs were, noted Charles. There were not large numbers of them. We could have destroyed all the labs and warehouses in the 3 primary provinces involved in drug trafficking: Helmand, Nangarhar, and Kandahar. In a week. I told flag officers, you have to see this as eating you alive, that if you don't do anything by 2006, you are going to need a lot more troops in Afghanistan. To emphasize his point, Charles asked the CIA to analyze where the drug money was going in Afghanistan. The answer was chilling. The agency told Charles that it was probable that some of the drug profits were being funneled into the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, an Al-Qaeda related group, the Hezb Islami group controlled by an anti-American renegade, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the Taliban, and possibly Al-Qaeda itself. The connections between drug trafficking and terrorism that the Pentagon didn't want to acknowledge were real and growing, and were clearly helping to fuel a revival of guerrilla activity in Afghanistan. The linkages were there, argues Charles. Throughout 2004, Charles's concerns were shunted aside by the Pentagon and the White House, but he persisted, and by the end of the year, he and his staff at the State Department were still pushing for a comprehensive Afghan counter-narcotics program. Excuse me. In effect, Charles wanted the United States to transplant to Central Asia many of the counter-narcotics tactics it had applied with some limited success in Latin America, which would be distributing it to the United States. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Just a joke. Take it easy. The most controversial of his proposals was an aggressive plan for the aerial spraying of the Afghan poppy fields, something that the Pentagon opposed for fear that it would incite anti-American violence. Something they don't care about in South America. Charles knew that there was strong opposition among Afghans to aerial spraying. False rumors that the United States was secretly spraying crops in rural Afghanistan had triggered protests and rampant conspiracy theories in the countryside. But Charles believed that Washington could gain support in Afghanistan as it had in Colombia if it launched a serious public campaign in support of spraying while providing significant aid for alternative agricultural development. The spraying could be conducted with the herbicide glyphosate, which would be Roundup, which is used by many Americans on their own gardens under the trade name Roundup. He was prepared to take a team of scientists to Kabul to show... Dude, just gonna spray Roundup over southern Afghanistan? What about the people? He was prepared to take a team of scientists to Kabul to show the Karzai government that a highly diluted version of glyphosate could be safely and effectively sprayed from the air with no serious health risks. He also tried to arrange a conference with 500 leading Afghan mullahs to convince them to support a public campaign outlining the dangers of heroin and to gain support for spraying. But U.S. Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad. Alright, start it again. Zalmay Khalilzad, along with Rumsfeld and Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, shared his opinion to an aggressive counter-narcotics program and repeatedly blocked Charles' efforts in Kabul. Charles eventually became convinced that Karzai voiced objections to stronger counter-narcotics measures only because he was under pressure from Rumsfeld and Khalilzad to resist the State Department's efforts. In addition to an aerial spraying campaign, Charles kept pushing for a more aggressive drug interdiction campaign, but that meant that the Defense Department had to change its guidance to American commanders in Afghanistan. The Pentagon had to tell the U.S. Central Command, which was in charge of military operations in Afghanistan, to start conducting missions to destroy drug labs and storage and production hubs. The bureaucratic forces of the Pentagon were still arrayed against Charles when Powell came to the White House for the post-election meeting of the War Cabinet to gain the president's endorsement of the State Department's counter-drug initiative. With Bobby Charles riding the back benches in the cramped White House Situation Room, Powell even was prepared to fight one of his last battles inside the Bush administration. And I'm going to end the episode there. Thanks for joining me. Stay tuned to the next episode, and we will finish the chapter. And if you like this show, hit that like and subscribe button, police. See you next time.